Evolution proves that we are all one. Any generalized argument from probability will group people into unity, integrating things that are separate together, and stating that some property that applies to the whole will apply to some subset of the individuals in a predictable fashion. Every individual or thing within that set, thereby delineating a certain number of things that are said to exist, with that number somehow being greater than one. But how do you prove there is more than one thing? Through division, which we do not want, we want unity. But then, this is why numbers are a hoax in the first place. The whole non-mathematical thinking towards things. And I know you can go off on very different tangents, such as math, and certain subjects being discriminatory by culture or by race. And there's like different levels of talent and different aptitudes and expertise on different levels. And sometimes people might come out and call that racist or something. But really, there's a racism that exists by default in nature because we'll tend to get together and self-segregate on some level. That allows us to categorize certain sets anyway. So most of the things that we're talking about are pattern recognition related anyway. But the generalization and capability to learn by pattern recognition to state that everything is not quite what it is, but rather an approximation of the full thing, and to connect it somehow enough to make some kind of argument that actually ends up showcasing the fact that we are all one. So the whole non-mathematical way of thinking is correct in its own right, as the division of one thing into two or more parts follows an arbitrary pathway cutting the thing apart. For any finitely sized shape, there would be an infinite number of ways to slice it, with no particular boundary of division being objective, but rather all being objective. In other words, where does one's freedom end and one's duty to conform to a standard exist? How would one define true freedom? That is another topic where it again is relative, but will be discussed more another time, with the main point being that we are all one. And we all know this to be the case, but it is further confirmed because, although deep down, we all know this to be the case, we do not always consciously acknowledge this, even though for the purposes of staving off conflict, we might as well state that we are all one in the sense that not only are numbers fake, but it is true as a fact, as an evolutionary argument, that we are all one, because all evolutionary theory states is that, in essence, things that are more likely to have something survive certain traits, certain behaviors, certain environmental or genetic attributes, end up dictating the survival status of a population, which means that numbers are fake. One might as well live as if one is living in infinite number of lives, in which everyone pays it forward, because that way, with that inspirational aura on others, you provide the greatest likelihood of your ideal future manifesting. You might as well live as if you wonder how the world would be if everyone acted the way you acted, because everyone else might as well be a manifestation of you, and vice versa. And basically, science proves it. Science from both perspectives. The body of knowledge constituting science, and the continued methodology of analytical knowledge discovery about nature. And that body of knowledge is expected to be believed in by the establishment, that is, public universities, and the narratives and things that are most likely to get funding. It sounds like a negative spin, but it's true that no field really is immune to corruption. And I don't believe you would see a sign of the demise of the oneness of humanity as I get back to my original point, which is that we could easily realize we're all one. And we always say this. We can always say we have more commonalities than we have differences. However, we are conflict-seeking and conflict-creating adventurers and warlike tribes also, and the tendency in elongated peace times is to eventually snap back to whatever is the most controversial or conflicting point that we can point out and focus on, thereby leading to the more societal friction. So conflict is the way in which we wish to change the world, basically, and we create as much conflict as how much change to the world we wish to have, which guarantees, therefore, by the way, that being the change that you want to see in the world will be the most conflicting and difficult thing that you ever do, even though you know you have to do it. And that conclusion is somewhat of a frightening one in the sense that you don't know just how hard it's going to be when you try to change things until you actually attempt it. And you can envision, you can have an ideal, you can have a plan, so to speak, but it only ends up poorly approximating the details of the actual execution itself, in a realistic scenario. And of course, because we believe in numbers, because we believe in division, we believe in the demarcation of total, countably distinct numbers of things that exist. We therefore create this conflict because we are creating division when we say that we are not already at one with the world, I guess somehow, despite the appeal and benefits of the analytical aspects of numbers. But perhaps every benefit has a cost. And so the notion that the economy is in a certain qualitative state, like how good things feel like they're going, based off of the economic numbers, is highly dubious, specious, or however you want to call it, given that you can feel how the quality of your life, or how easy it is for you to work on fulfilling your dreams and goals, or how pressed you feel to fight for your own marginal, unlikely survival at any given moment. And clearly, I think people know how they feel, and mostly feel the same way that the majority of people feel, which is the notion that things have gone downhill for a while, a few years, however long you want to say. And there may be many different stories, but it rings true. You could state certain positives or negatives, which are measurable, but it's about, well, do we have enough energy, and not just purely economic growth numbers? Although, you can at least look at the trend in those things. Although those kinds of numbers and employment numbers are also rigged because there's what? The U3 and the U6. And the way that one is measured, it doesn't count people are unemployed and not looking for employment even, and have just given up and dropped out of the workplace, or people who are considered underemployed or just not doing what they want to do full time relative to their education level or such. So you have a number of things that can be swayed dishonestly to try and report things better than they actually are by switching scales. And the notion of trusting that we can correctly separate things into the right number of component parts, make the best decision kind of plays into this type of numerical thinking. Well, since we're dealing with numbers, we're looking at things at the right scale, at the right level of resolution, and devoting the right amount and style of mental energy toward the decision-making process and reasoning our way to an answer great enough to justify that process. And yes, thinking of things as component structures allows us analysis that has led to much greater technological development, and that's good and all. However, you also have the factor of dependency, which is a hidden cost. And the fact that greater levels of dependency within an economy create lower chances of survival should any crucial layer of the infrastructure people count on to comfortably survive within civilization. Like, are we people as capable of surviving as we should be? Not only surviving, being content in the state and standard of survival that they are capable of providing for ourselves. If some level of dependency were to collapse, like anything, electric grid, water, grid, high-speed internet, anything like that. Because some of this you don't need for survival, but you do need in the sense of being comfortable. And since we're more stuck today being uncomfortably comfortable with being comfortable, it means the bulk of us almost certainly wouldn't be able to survive a scenario that brings us back to pre-civilizational times. That's the dilemma that we kind of need to improve basically as a global culture and as a species, because the globalization of everything has made it hard to actually accurately reflect on the best practices and needs of the local community. Yes, we can care about our local communities, but through the lens of viewing oneself as a global citizen, one's globalist ideologies just might end up not benefiting one's own area. So it remains a dilemma of which balance to strike, and it probably depends on cultural compatibility with trade partners and how tight-knit or isolationist a society wants to be, perhaps in order to retain its culture. So are we getting better, or are we getting worse? Well, depends what we focus on. Right. And as I said before, we may want conflict, so we will always rise the occasion to create as much conflict as we need to exactly balance, where we are comfortably agreeing and disagreeing at the right rate. The perfect ideal scenario of civilization means to any particular person, but of course, that has to be different for every person. Some might not want any conflict. But does the financial independence argument, as I said earlier though, mean that by trying to get out of the system, we actually end up becoming an integral part of that system in the sense of using AI and creative technological advancement to get ahead while disparaging or warning about the powers of AI overall? and how it muddies the water of what counts as genuine human expression or experience or communication to some point that you wonder about the value overall. You wonder about the culture that socially binds together the species and wonder how cohesive of a culture that is. So what do you do about it? I guess you have to focus on what you can affect and do as much as you can from your own perspective to change the paradigm and the way you see fit in order to defeat the current system. And the best way to change your system is to do it in a way that is critically damped in vibrational terms. Oscillating spring-like damped systems would return back to their equilibrium position the fastest by barely not overshooting or undershooting the stable point, which requires some form of wisdom to achieve. It solves or prevents the greatest amount of conflict and the least amount of exertion or energy burned, I guess. So the most harmonious possible arrangement of the timeline, therefore, exists in acknowledging that we do have differences and we're never going to be fully united on everything. But at the same time, to smoothly somehow live and let live in a way that makes it possible for everybody to make their own fulfillment more likely without interfering to an extent that makes the fulfillment of others less likely. But striving toward that outcome depends heavily on our mindset and capacity for not only empathy, but predictiveness. And so, for example, if we have the financial mindset that it's all about money and the economic numbers, then you're kind of missing out on what really counts in life from a level of quality and fulfillment, because you can always fool yourself and think it's about outputting some more economic numbers to end up fulfilled, which we all know never really fully works. And really, at that point, might as well scratch the word economy out of your vocabulary. But this is more so about production through your own skills, the capacity to produce, so that you can have a differential in production and consumption that is in your favor. Because being given points to consume with doesn't equate to an economy. That's only one end of it. It's really consumption points you hope aren't too distorted in the long process of middlemen between your actual production and the consumption of that production, so that enough of the human endeavor within that system is generally preserved. And that is the toughest task to do with any financial system, because it always expands and corrupts and inflates if it is a fiat system and collapses each time at some point, apparently. And so I guess it's not a question if it'll happen, but when, because the expansion of corruption is inherently built into that system, where you can always promise more value or supply in order to pump an asset or make a sale, with the idea being that it actually adds more value to the world rather than taking away value from something else, and perhaps even in the overall market or universe. So once you understand the guaranteed collapse of any fiat, what are you doing about that? Well, the fact that it is not only possible, but guaranteed to happen, means some component of your plan ought to involve it happening this lifetime. So what are you doing about what you might perceive I'm alluding to as a collapse somewhat in the financial system and the interdependence, reliability of everything, and the fact that you might have to learn a lot more skills if a decline, recession, depression, or whatever you want to call it, actually plays out? And hopefully not. Hopefully not. But we have to be very prepared for that scenario, and it probably makes sense to be more and more prepared for that scenario. The more people are dependent on more other people, the interdependency amount of which makes the economy look very good in terms of the numbers, since sales and economic consumption numbers show our dependence on each other's ways of recording transactions that are part of some mythical financial system. And as soon as you start to record some transactions, you boost the incentive to continue to record more transactions until at some point the critical mass of the situation leads to lower and lower productivity and higher obsession over recording transactions, paperwork, bureaucracy, and ways of patting ourselves on the backs in order to stave off any perception of lack of interdependency or a decrease in bureaucracy. The incentive to increase the amount of stuff measured in the economy is so strong that, in most cases, most of the value in markets is speculative rather than actual. Because as soon as your earnings multiples expand, they just are kind of a pyramid scheme at that point. Because at that point, you have every incentive to just keep on promising the reliability of everything, meaning that a company will be around for a greater number of years, therefore increasing its value. But by promising for a greater number of years, you're making it less likely that your claims are going to come true. So wanting your own pay to go up, for example, while wanting the cost of everything you consume to go down, it's kind of like be careful what you wish for. Right. In a way, we shouldn't want the cost of everything to go down, including our own paychecks, so that our dependence on system goes down. But instead, we want our dependence on the system to go up in the sense of reserving the highest number of currency units possible for yourself. And the number of currency units available at any given time is just dependent on the currency issuing body's desires for there to be that amount of currency available. And it's like, how do you get out of that corruption loop? So what are you doing? What are you doing to be less dependent on the financial system in every sense? Because either way, you're kind of dependent on the financial system, because you either have to buy into it so that you're actually obsessed with it because you want to maximize your position within it as much as possible as early as possible to be guaranteed the longest possible retirement as possible, which everyone else is also doing at the same time, leading to the ballooning expansion of multiples and promises in economic numbers. And the whole eternal economic growth argument, which is now borderline sounding like Greta Thunberg at this point, which is unintended. How dare you? But either way, what do you think? Interestingly enough, the thing that you want to become, or not become, I should say, is what you will become by being the change that you wish to see in the world. Because we all want financial freedom, which means we're focused on money, which means we want a way to rig everything financially in our favor as much as possible. But then, how do you do that? You do it by figuring out some kind of life hack or something, which you don't really know is going to work as well as planned or advertised. What ends up happening when you try to be the change you wish to see in the world is you try to optimize your situation by simplifying your life and having the luxury of not caring so much about the financial system from being so well off, because it is just a bunch of numbers and phony accounting tricks and debts and statements of promise that something is worth something because it is stated on paper or electrons or whatever it is by some governing body. No, we should have the ability to state otherwise, because most of the time, if we're talking about financial freedom in terms of getting off the grid, then we're more so talking about, like, having close to no money whatsoever, aka doing everything or having everything available for yourself. But that means providing it all for yourself rather than being granted. And it's the paradox of wanting to be so good within a system that you transcend that system. But how can it be? The only way to transcend is to not play, or continually minimize the extent to which you're playing. And notion that everyone is entitled to a survival of a certain degree of comfort, no matter how lazy or how hard-working they are, or how much exertion they genuinely bring to the table, is one that exists in many circles, whereas other survivalism ideas might state otherwise. And it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell sometimes how hard anyone is working, most of which, possibly oneself. Basically, you yourself can also be highly susceptible to not working as hard as you think you're working, even though you're always around, but not necessarily taking notes. You can make a real fool of yourself because it's all about the numbers, and so therefore, it's about fudging the numbers and still getting approval, playing it off like the numbers meant something they didn't, bringing into question the whole notion that we should objectively buy into numbers despite the levels of dishonesty and corruption so apparently built in and incentivized by such a system. And so, regarding this whole AI thing, one might say that AI is cheapening or bringing down the realism in the world, since everything is trending towards AI generation in terms of some forms of creative expression, at least, or anything to do with data processing, maybe, other than actual fulfillment of physical tasks requiring human-like discretion. AI is not quite as specialized as to achieve this. When it comes to doing specialized tasks that are expected to elicit a predictable range of human behaviors and discretions, what's a better human than, like, an actual human? There is no better substitution for a human than an actual human. So AI will automatically never be superior to humans in the sense that what we want as humans is genuine human activity. But you don't really get that when you see everything trending towards AI, because you only get some kind of approximation that you hope is acceptable and is advertised to be better because it is measured on a certain scale, come up with to only measure its benefits, not its costs. But what about the scale that was created in nature naturally by humanity's equivalent to itself, and the congruence argument? I would state again that on those grounds, AI could not be superior or even equal to a human, because what you mean by superior is very good. And what is good is what you like, basically, in one sense. And if what's good is what you like, and what you like makes you comfortable, then the uncanny valley of expression in the era of having just enough AI generation that you can't really tell what is a realistic, genuine form of human expression anymore, even if you can tell AI generation from genuine human dialogue, because at some point, the humans themselves will be interfacing with AI enough to be influenced by its expressive tendencies as well, thus merging us with AI, but also the numerically divisible ideology backing the programming iterations that generate AI. The unity that arises from such an ideology of division must therefore be a false unity. And so what value is there to anything? Placing value in an economic sense brings the numbers automatically in favor of thinking everything in terms of a measurable economy. But as soon as you start to think of everything as a quantifiable, measurable economy, you start to want that thing to go up in value, because you start having a stake in it and its profits, and all with a belief in that system. And the question is, how valid of a description does that give to the system? Like, how real is the economy? And do we need a new economics? Perhaps a mainstream theory that is more thermodynamic in nature? Well, the real economy is what we experience in terms of resources and energy movement in nature in the real world. That is the real economy. It's the flow of resources. But can we really measure that? There's no measure really to that ultimately, because it's relative to what you're looking at as flow and resources. Many directions of the wind we ignore, but some breezes would also be thought of as energy production opportunities, convertible to electricity, which can be sold at a certain cost, thereby seeing the air's kinetic energy as an economic commodity. And so, since natural work and calories burned can be seen with respect to accomplishing tasks that you desire to some accuracy, some inner product or dot product between the two vectors, one of which is your goal, your aim, in other words, and the other vector is your result. The question is, what did you hit? And how many degrees were you off? What's the cosine? What's the factor of that result angled towards the goal? And that result has to do with the amount of work done on a system and how much productivity has gone on in the physical world. So that is a real definition of work, which, although it is relative to which direction the goal is, it at least inarguably exists. This physically definable level of real work in terms of energy output has to at least contribute some quantity to the economic value of any asset if it has other quantities which are non-physical storages of work. And on that note, it is very hard to state accurately the value of any given work that is intellectual in nature, because the relation of any intellectual contribution to a work is an argument that depends on many what-ifs, like would they have figured out how to proceed anyway without your consultation or input, or even without your input, would they have at least done a reasonably similar level of quality work? Despite the tendency and incentive to state the value in things that haven't occurred as if they are guaranteed, it will be our downfall. Things tend to grow at a certain naturally sustainable rate, which can fluctuate, though not by too much, as a signal that cannot be read is a useless or counterproductive signal. What we would not expect in a reasonable, rational market is growth at a rate which is seen in some modern tech startups. So in that sense, this expanded multiple era, it is very likely that in an expanded multiple era, many tech stocks are simply overvalued, because a lot of the value built into it is the promise of it performing very well and becoming a near necessity for many people into the distant future, thus reaching price-to-earnings ratios approaching 30 or even 50. This gives you insight into the fact that so much more about the modern world has to do with speculation rather than reality, which is strange because the things we're speculating on are so unreal that there's actually much less certainty to them than you would have about older companies that provide the things that physically keep us alive in the real economy, the flow of actual resources, the goods in terms of raw materials, foods, transportation, material enrichment, drilling, energy production, manufacturing, and all the infrastructure that keeps us alive and safe. A baseline must exist regardless of how much more valuable speculative companies say they are, which has to involve claiming credit for some amount of the productive output we currently or will eventually have, because what you're relating the output to is the value of some service, perhaps some increase in productivity or efficiency from their continued inputs. But can you really value some discretionary service more than you value the things that sustain your life itself? That is the question, and I don't know if you can make that call. And so, therefore, you might as well introduce some kind of minimum, the definition of a dollar or currency unit, as it relates to the expected survivability of an actual human, and what portion of their survival needs is likely to be met by earning and using that money to sustain a living using modern adjusted metrics, and that cost of living, and the fact that we somehow have still discretionary spending, I think, is strange. The notion of having discretionary spending for productive endeavors, as in investments into bettering yourself and your skills in productive capacities, is worth it. But the investment into consumption-based capacities kind of just kills our spirits by demotivating us as a species when you think about it. Like, why would you have a leisure class or an economy that is based on the measurement of core earnings and corporations that essentially account to consumption? Should we just redirect all excess resources into investing in further skills and opportunities for productivity? And what constitutes that? Like, should the amount of consumption equate to how strong our economy is? Should it not be the amount of production? And in addition to that, the capacity for us to turn our overproduction also into production by repurposing things, reusing certain waste products of other processes, and things to make sure that even if we overproduce, for example, we actually make it out on top still. By exporting things, we have a comparative advantage in the production of. So think about how you will view the economy from now on, and how productivity is an almost hidden variable which is best grasped intuitively in many cases rather than quantitatively. Thank you.